forest was like a fortress of shadows, its halls overgrown and echoing with unseen footsteps. Trish stumbled through the bushes, her breath ragged, her hands trembling, and eyes wide as they flicked from side to side. The voices in her head were relentless tonight, a chorus of hisses that swallowed every other sound. Kill him. Free yourself. Silence us. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of their command. In her arms, swaddled in a tattered blanket, was her baby brother Jake, barely a year old, his soft coos a stark contrast to the evil in her mind. Trish was 16, orphaned by a fire that claimed their parents, and left her with nothing but Jake and the voices. They'd started as whispers after the fire, soft and mournful, promising peace if she obeyed. A promise that would never be kept. The voices grew louder, hungrier, feeding on her depression, her guilt, her loneliness. They told her Jake was the chain binding her to misery. Kill him, and you'll be free. She fought them. Oh, how she fought. But with each whisper, her head felt like a dynamic exploded in it, until the weight of her grief made her weak. She stopped at the edge of a clearing, tears streaming down her face. Jake stirred, his tiny hand brushing her cheek. I'm sorry, she sobbed, her voice breaking. I love you, but I can't let them win. The voices screamed, clawing at her skull. She set Jake down on a bed of moss, kissed his forehead, and ran, her sobs echoing through the trees. She believed she was saving him from her, from the monster she might become. But the voices lied. They didn't stop. They laughed.
20 years later, Jake stood at the edge of the same forest. Now a man of 21. He was tall, lean, with eyes that held a quiet sorrow. Raised by a barren seamstress named Eliza and her blacksmith husband Tom, Jake had grown up with love, but also an ache he couldn't name. It was a hollow feeling, like a piece of his soul was missing, tethered to someone he didn't know. He'd always felt it, a pull toward something or someone, lost in the fog of his past. Eliza and Tom had found him as a baby, abandoned in the forest, and raised him as their own. They taught him kindness, resilience, and the value of a steady hand. But Jake struggled. Nightmares plagued him, flashes of fire, a girl's tear-streaked face, and a voice that wasn't his own, whispering, "You're alone." He'd wake in a cold sweat, the loneliness gnawing at him, even in the warmth of his adoptive home. The town of Gray Hollow, where Jake lived, and was small, superstitious, and wary of the forest. They spoke of a ghost, a girl who wandered its depths, her cries heard on moonless nights. Jake dismissed the tales, but the forest called to him. He'd stand at its edge, feeling that strange connection, like a thread tugging at his heart.
Trish never escaped the voices. They followed her, growing crueler with each passing year. She wandered from town to town, a shadow of herself, her depression a heavy cloak. The voices no longer promised freedom. They mocked her for abandoning Jake, for believing their lies. You left him, you're nothing, kill, and we'll be quiet. She resisted, but their weight was crushing. She'd see Jake's face in every child she passed, and the guilt was a knife in her chest. One night, in a rundown tavern on the outskirts of Gray Hollow, Trish overheard a story about a young man named Jake, raised by a seamstress, who worked as a carpenter and was haunted by dreams. Her heart stopped. It couldn't be, but the pull was undeniable. She returned to the forest, the voices roaring, urging her to find him, not to reunite, but to finish what they'd started.
Jake, too, was drawn back to the forest that night, driven by a nightmare more vivid than ever. A girl, sobbing, leaving him behind. He didn't know why, but he needed answers. As he stepped into the trees, the air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to writhe. Somewhere deep within, Trish moved toward him, her mind a battlefield, the voices chanting for blood. The forest held its breath, waiting for their paths to cross. The moon hung like a dead eye above the night sky as Jake pushed deeper into the forest, following a path that seemed to remember his feet. Each step felt like coming home and walking toward his grave at the same time. The nightmare had been different this time, clearer. He could still feel the phantom weight of small arms around his neck, hear the broken whisper, "I'm sorry, I love you, but I can't."
20 yards away, Trish moved through the same darkness like a specter, her bare feet silent on the forest floor. The voices had reached a fever pitch, drowning out her own thoughts until she wasn't sure where they ended, and she began. "He's close," they hissed. "So close. End it. End him. End us all." "No," she whispered, pressing her palms against her temples. "He's my brother. He's all I have left." "You have nothing. You are nothing. Look what you've become." She caught her reflection in a puddle of moonlight, hollowed cheeks, wild hair, eyes that had forgotten how to hope. The voices were right. She was nothing. A walking corpse animated by guilt and madness. But then she heard it.
Jake was humming a lullaby he didn't remember learning, one that had always lived in his bones. The same lullaby Trish used to sing to him during those few months before the fire, when they still had parents, when the world still made sense. The sound stopped her cold. The voices fell silent for the first time in 20 years, as if they too were listening, waiting. Jake stopped humming when he saw her. She stood in a shaft of moonlight, looking like something carved from shadow and sorrow. Her eyes, God, those eyes were the same ones from his nightmares, but older now, haunted by decades of pain.
"Jake," she whispered, and his name on her lips was both a prayer and a confession.
He knew her instantly, the way you know your own heartbeat. The missing piece of his soul stood before him, broken and beautiful and terrible. "Trish," the word came out cracked, barely audible.
She took a step forward, then stopped as the voices roared back to life. "Kill him, now! While he's close!" Her hand moved to the knife at her belt. When had she drawn it? When had she even picked it up? The voices were so loud now she could barely think, barely breathe. "Stay back!" she gasped, the blade trembling in her grip. "Please, Jake, just stay back." But he moved closer instead, his hands raised, his voice gentle. "It's okay. I remember now. I remember you singing to me. I remember the fire. I remember. You remember me leaving you." The words were acid on her tongue. "I remember you saving me." The simple statement hit her like a physical blow. The voices shrieked their disagreement. But for a moment, just a moment, she could see past their lies to the truth. She had saved him. She had chosen his life over the voices' demands, even though it had cost her everything.
"They're not just in your head, are they?" Jake said, his carpenter's eye taking in the way the shadows seemed to bend toward them, the way the trees leaned in like they were listening.
Trish shook her head, tears streaming. "They started after the fire. They said they were our parents, trying to guide us. But parents don't." She gestured helplessly at the knife, at herself, at the wasteland of her life. "What do they want?" "Blood," she whispered. "Always blood. First yours, then others. They feed on it, on the pain, on the guilt. I've been carrying them for 20 years, and they've only gotten stronger." Jake stepped closer, close enough now that she could have reached out and touched him. The knife shook in her hand, but she didn't raise it. Couldn't.
"What if we faced them together?" The voices erupted in fury at his words. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The trees creaked and groaned as something vast and hungry stirred in the darkness around them. "Foolish boy," the voices said, but they weren't coming from Trish's head anymore. They were coming from everywhere. The trees, the ground, the air itself. "You think love can save her? She's ours now, has been for 20 years. "No," Jake said firmly. "She's my sister." The forest exploded into motion. Branches whipped down like grasping fingers. Roots erupted from the ground, and something that might have been laughter echoed from every shadow. But Jake didn't flinch. He reached for Trish's hand, and when their fingers touched, the knife fell, forgotten, to the forest floor. The moment their hands connected, visions flooded both their minds. Not memories, but truths the voices had kept hidden. The fire that killed their parents hadn't been an accident. It had been started by something ancient, something that fed on family bonds, on love, turned to grief. Their parents had died, trying to perform a ritual, trying to bind the entity before it could claim their children. They had failed, but not completely. The entity, call it demon, call it curse, call it the weight of generations of pain, had been wounded in the attempt. It needed time to heal, time to grow strong again. So it had whispered to Trish, convinced her to abandon Jake, breaking the family bond that might have protected them both. For 20 years, it had fed on Trish's guilt, her isolation, her despair, and now it was strong enough to claim them both. Clever children, the voices sneered as the trees pressed closer. But too late. Far too late.
Maybe, Trish said, her voice steadier now than it had been in years. But we're together again. She began to hum the lullaby. Jake joined in, his deeper voice harmonizing with hers, creating something beautiful in the darkness. The entity recoiled as if burned. No, the bond was broken. You made sure I left, Trish said, still humming between words. But you couldn't make me stop loving him. That never broke. Never could.
What happened next wasn't really a fight in any conventional sense. It was a war between love and despair, between connection and isolation, fought on a battlefield of memory and emotion. The entity threw everything at them. Visions of their parents burning, phantom children screaming in the night, the weight of every life Trish might have taken if she'd given in to the voices. It made the forest itself into a weapon. Branches grabbing, roots tangling, shadows taking solid form. But Jake and Trish held on to each other and kept humming. The lullaby became their shield, their sword, their prayer. It was something their mother had sung, and her mother before her, passed down through generations, as protection against the very thing that now sought to destroy them. As they sang, light began to gather around them. Not visible light, but something deeper. The light of connection, of family bonds that transcend death, of love that endures even when everything else falls away. The entity began to weaken, its voice becoming less commanding, more desperate. Please, it whispered. I've been alone so long, the hunger, the cold. And in that moment, both Jake and Trish understood the horrifying truth. The thing that had tormented them wasn't some misunderstood creature. It was pure malevolence, ancient and patient. It had been feeding on families for centuries, destroying bonds not out of loneliness, but out of exquisite cruelty. It reveled in turning love into weapons of self-destruction. You want to know what I am? The voice was no longer pleading, but triumphant. I am the thing that made your mother scream your father's name as she burned. I am the reason she tried to save you both and failed.
Suddenly, phantom images flooded their minds. Not visions, but memories stolen from their dying parents. Their mother, trapped in the burning house, reaching desperately for baby Jake's crib, while their father held the flames back with his own body. The entity had whispered to her too, convinced her that Jake was already dead, that she should save herself. She had believed the lie for precious seconds, seconds that cost them all their lives.
I feast on the moment love becomes regret, it continued, savoring their anguish. Your sister has been my masterpiece. 20 years of self-hatred, of believing she abandoned you. But the beautiful irony, she saved your life by leaving you. I wanted her to kill you that night, but her love was still too strong. So I made her suffer instead.
Trish collapsed to her knees, the full weight of manipulation crushing down on her. Every moment of guilt, every night she'd wished she were dead, every time she'd almost given in to the voices, it had all been orchestrated. The entity hadn't just fed on her pain, it had cultivated it like a garden, harvesting her suffering year after year.
And now, the final harvest. Watch her break, boy. Watch her realize that every breath she's taken for 20 years has been stolen from the children I made her almost kill.
The entity showed them more flashes of Trish's wandering years. The times she'd stood over sleeping children, knife in hand, fighting the voices. The families she'd fled from in the middle of the night rather than hurt them. The bridge she'd stood on for hours, trying to work up the courage to jump. But worst of all, the children who had died because she hadn't been there to save them. Other siblings the entity had claimed while she was busy drowning in her own guilt. Families destroyed while she was too broken to help.
6 children last year alone, it whispered lovingly. Their blood is on her hands as much as mine. Every moment she spent wallowing in self-pity was a moment I used to claim fresh victims. Jake watched his sister crumble, her body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. This wasn't grief, this was complete spiritual destruction. Trish, no, he whispered, reaching for her. It's lying. You fought it. You saved me. You saved yourself. But she couldn't hear him over the entity's laughter, over the weight of 20 years of carefully orchestrated manipulation finally revealed in all its horrific glory. The best part, the entity continued, she could have ended this decades ago. The lullaby your mother taught her? It was the key all along. But I made her forget, made her believe she was powerless. Convinced her that love was weakness, instead of the very weapon that could destroy me. The forest began to change around them. The trees twisted into shapes that looked almost human, the forms of every family the entity had destroyed over the centuries. Mothers reaching for children they couldn't save. Fathers burning alive, trying to protect their families. Siblings turned against each other by whispered lies. "I'm going to make you kill each other," it said with satisfaction. Just like all the others. The beautiful irony is that your love, the very thing that could save you, will be the weapon I use to destroy you. I'll make her believe you're another hallucination. I'll make you think she's already possessed, and you'll tear each other apart trying to save each other. Trish's hand moved to the knife again, but this time her eyes were vacant, unseeing. The entity was already in her mind, showing her Jake as the monster, as the source of all her pain. "Kill him," it whispered in her mother's voice. "Kill him and be free. Kill him, or watch him kill innocent children like you should have killed." Jake saw the exact moment his sister disappeared behind her own eyes, saw the thing wearing her face turn toward him with the knife raised. "Trish?" he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please, remember the lullaby, remember who we are." But she couldn't hear him anymore. The entity had finally won. As she lunged forward, Jake made his choice. He opened his arms, refusing to defend himself, choosing love even in the face of death. "I forgive you," he whispered as the blade fell toward his heart. The words hit the entity like a physical blow. "No, you can't, not after everything I've shown you."
But Jake's forgiveness, complete, unconditional, absolute, began to burn away the lies like sunlight through darkness. The knife stopped inches from his chest as Trish fought back against the entity's control, her love for her brother stronger than any manipulation. And in that moment of perfect, devastating love that persisted despite decades of orchestrated cruelty, the lullaby began again, not sung but lived, not heard but felt in the depths of their souls. The entity's screams of rage echoed through the forest as its centuries of careful cruelty began to unravel, destroyed not by violence, but by the one thing it could never understand or corrupt: love that forgives everything, even the unforgivable. The entity writhed in agony as the lullaby, powered by forgiveness it couldn't comprehend, tore through its essence like acid. It had fed on guilt, hatred, and despair for centuries, growing fat on the corruption of love. But pure, selfless love was poison to its very being. "No," it screamed as it began to dissolve. "I have claimed thousands, destroyed countless families. I am eternal." But Jake and Trish's voices grew stronger, their harmony perfect despite their tears. The entity's form began to fragment, revealing the truth beneath its malevolence. Not a creature at all, but a twisted accumulation of every moment it had perverted love into hatred, every family bond it had shattered, every innocent life it had claimed. As it died, it showed them one final cruelty, flashes of every single family it had destroyed, every child it had claimed, every parent it had driven mad with grief. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. All the lives that could have been saved if someone, anyone, had found the strength to fight back sooner. "Look at them all," it gasped with its final breath. "Look at what your 20 years of cowardice cost the world." Trish screamed, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to shatter the night itself. The weight of all those lost lives, all that preventable suffering, crashed down on her like a collapsing mountain. She had saved Jake, yes. But at what costs to everyone else? The entity's laughter echoed one last time as it dissolved completely, leaving behind only the terrible knowledge of what they could have prevented.
Jake caught his sister as she collapsed, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her shattered soul. She had fought the monster for 20 years, and in the end, they had won. But victory had come at a price that might destroy her anyway. "All those children," she whispered against his chest, "all those families, I could have stopped it. I could have saved them." And Jake, holding his broken sister in the ruins of their triumph, finally understood the true horror of what they had faced. The entity hadn't just been evil, it had been brilliant in its cruelty, ensuring that even its defeat would be hollow, poisoned by the knowledge of what its victory had cost the world. They had saved each other, but they were the only ones left to save. The forest was silent now, empty of malevolence, but heavy with the weight of countless lost souls. And in that silence, Jake and Trish held each other and wept, not just for themselves, but for every family that had been destroyed while they fought their own battle against the dark. They were free, but freedom had never felt so much like damnation.
They walked back to Grey Hollow in silence, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of resolution. It was the hollow silence of two people carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. Jake tried to be strong for Trish, but he couldn't shake the images the entity had shown them. All those children, all those families, the parents who died believing their love had failed, never knowing they were fighting an ancient evil that had been manipulating them from the beginning. Trish moved like a ghost beside him, her eyes vacant, her spirit crushed under the magnitude of what they had learned. She had thought her 20 years of suffering were about her own guilt, her own failure. But they had been so much more. They had been the entity's victory lap, its celebration of all the lives it was claiming while she drowned in manufactured self-hatred. When they reached the edge of town, Trish stopped walking. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How do I live with this? How do I wake up every morning knowing that my cowardice cost the world so much?" Jake wanted to comfort her, to tell her it wasn't her fault, but the words felt hollow. The entity was gone, but the damage it had done, to them, to countless others, remained like an infected wound. "We do better," he said finally, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "We make sure no one else goes through what we went through, what they went through." But even as he said it, he wondered if it was enough. If anything could ever be enough to balance the scales of so much preventable suffering. They stood there at the edge of everything, two broken people who had saved each other but lost so much more in the process. The victory felt as heavy as defeat, love as painful as loss. They had their lives back, but the cost would haunt them forever.
In the end, some victories are harder to bear than defeat. Some truths are too heavy for the human heart to carry. But Jake and Trish would carry them anyway, because that was what love meant. Not just saving each other, but living with the weight of what that salvation had cost the world. The story ends, but the haunting has just begun.